welcome back. And as was mentioned earlier in the show, the focus of this segment is our recap and wrap-up of COP21. And joining us for this conversation, back from Paris just earlier this week, we have Carlos Fuller, who is the International and Regional Liaison Officer of the Caribbean Community Climate Change Center, the 5Cs. Good morning and welcome.
Good morning, Marlene. It's a pleasure to be here.
And thank you for being able to join us and give us a full update as to how things panned out.
Yes, it is good to be back home after 3 long weeks in Paris, very cold weather, but very successful and was great being there because we were part of a very historic agreement that was finally pulled off.
Now, we had our conversation about what the expectations were going into the conference. And because of past experiences, you were a bit wary as to how optimistic you can really be in terms of reaching an agreement. The agreement that was decided on, when did you realize that we would be able to put together something formally to affect climate change?
At the end of the first week of formal negotiations, we recognized that all the ingredients that we wanted in the agreement were there. The issue now was, it was such a large document, would the presidency of the COP, the Minister of France, be able to pare it down to something that was legible, that was an agreement that could be signed on by all people. And at the 13th hour, he was able to pull it off indeed.
As it usually happens.
Right.
So what were some of the sticking points in terms of putting together the agreement?
Well, there were several. First, and most of them were the asks of Belize and the Caribbean region. Yeah. That is, that we wanted a sufficiently ambitious agreement that would keep global temperature rise to 1.5 degrees Celsius above the pre-industrial level. Mm-hmm. While there were many developing countries in particular, and a few developed countries who thought that that target was too ambitious, because it meant that they would have to take on more difficult carbon reducing measures. But we held our sway. We had enough both technical and moral support from the outside that we held the day. And so the new agreement specifies that the objective is to hold warming to 2 degrees Celsius, aiming towards 1.5.
So that's such an important point to be able to highlight. The regional agreement or demands from the Caribbean itself that was put together before, as you had mentioned, it became very important in the negotiations itself. I remember as a part of the demands from the Caribbean, you were looking at compensation, and anytime it comes to financial resources, it's usually a sticky topic. So how did that part go? Indeed,
both things happened there, where we had a very strong commitment on finance in general to support our ability to do the mitigation and adaptation. And the agreement now recognizes the importance of loss and damage. Yeah. So that is a central part of the agreement. A separate article on loss and damage is there. It does state that all parties are to avoid loss and damage to whatever extent is possible, but where it will occur, a mechanism has been established to work on it, on how we address it. So it does not have specific say that we will compensate for. In fact, there's actually a sentence and it says, this, because this is an agreement, does not mean that we agree that we are liable for it.
Okay. So that was obviously a part of the negotiations that took place, because it's not necessarily saying they will cover whatever costs that are suffered in this region because of climate change,
exactly.
But that they'll look at it.
Exactly. It's a very carefully worded agreement that navigates a thin line between both.
Yeah. And I mean, what is your reaction to that?
Well, I think that was the best that could be expected. That is, we have to recognize that it is the entire international community that has caused climate change, not 1 or 2 countries per se. Yes, they started it, but all of us have taken on that industrial revolution, trying to achieve development through the use of fossil fuels and deforestation. So we all have contributed to it. So we are all liable to some extent, some more than others, and maybe the liability of others is going to increase over time as we try to attain that level of development. So we had to recognize that it's a global issue and we require a global solution to it. So it does include things, for example, creating innovative insurance mechanisms which all of us would then contribute to. So yes, it's important that we bring in the private sector, the people from Wall Street and so on, who can come up with these financial instruments that we can use towards that end.
Yeah. So let's talk about some of the other elements of the agreement. And as you had pointed out, it's an historic achievement after attempting several times to be able to get a formal agreement. So let's talk about what some of the highlights are. The 2% with the aim of 1.5 is obviously the ultimate goal.
Correct. So that is the ultimate goal. And then there are specific things that are put in place to achieve that goal. So for example, each country is required to submit now every 5 years what their contributions are going to be towards that goal. So it's going to be a 5-year cycle where all of us do that. It also provides financial resources for developing countries to achieve that goal, because yes, we can set a goal, but for us, we also need the support in financing, in technology, and capacity to do that. So that is also embedded in the agreement. It establishes a market mechanism where each country can establish its own internal market to achieve that end, and a fungible market where if your country exceeds what it promised to do, it can then trade with another country which has not achieved that. So again, a huge trading mechanism has been established. The details, of course, are going to be worked out in the next 5 years as we go towards it. So that is certainly in it. The issue of adaptation is central to the agreement, especially for countries like Belize, because our emissions are so low. Adaptation is going to be our big focus. Again, so there's political parity between mitigation and adaptation.
How would you describe the difference between the two?
Well, for mitigation, there are concrete targets, while in adaptation, we establish a goal, but it's very difficult to put a target on adaptation, meaning X number of miles of seawall or so many miles of beachfront that you're going to protect. That part becomes much too difficult, very country specific, even region specific, because what you say I might want to do for Placencia might not be applicable to San Pedro or to Gales Point, so that becomes a much more difficult thing to quantify. But we do indicate that developing countries will tell the international community, this is what I want to do, this is what it's going to cost me to do. And again, the 5-year cycle also plays a role there, where we can say this is what we need in the next 5 years, and at the end of the 5 years we can say this is what we received, with what we received, this is what we were able to accomplish. So a very transparent system has been put in place to be able to explain what you need to do, what has been provided, and all of this is going to be put on available on the Secretariat's website. So it's open and transparent to the international community that we're not taking money and not being able to account for it.
Yes, yes. And I suppose one of the things that people can be able to speculate about is, how do you ensure, not you, I mean, how do countries keep each other accountable for adherence? Because it is definitely a milestone that the agreement was reached. However, only time will tell whether or not actual efforts will be made.
So it's in that respect, it's twofold. The transparency system, which I mentioned, which is, we will submit every 5 years, and a compliance system has been put in place of a technical committee which will look at all the documentation that countries provide to show how they have achieved it. And we want to make sure that the numbers that they say match up with the various rules that are going to be put in place. So, and it is a much more facilitative compliance system as opposed to one that is going to penalize. Because where penalties are concerned in an international agreement really requires the political will. There is no international policeman that is going to go into any country. So it's going to be facilitative to say, hey, if you can accomplish this and you have said you've done it, then you can get much more. As opposed to, well, hey, you said you were going to do this, you got the resources, you could not do it, well, it's very unlikely that you're going to get more resources to do the same thing again.
So it's like using parenting skills in their negotiation, positive reinforcement.
Exactly. The same thing we were talking about earlier in the show, Parity.
So, what do you think are some of the ingredients in terms of the global conversation that led to all the political leaders being willing to sign on to the agreement?
Well, there were many things that came together. Don't forget that we were hoping that this would have occurred in Copenhagen back in 2009,
And it almost did.
Exactly. And in one respect, it failed because of the process.
Yeah.
But it's certainly the ingredients were put in place that developing countries recognized that they had a role to play. And even though that agreement in Copenhagen was only noted, the following year in Cancun, it basically was then put in place by a decision that made it concrete. And that was the building blocks for what occurred this year. We must acknowledge the great role that the French did throughout the entire year as they were working up towards it. For example, they came to Martinique, the President Hollande came to Martinique, held the Caribbean Summit, heard what our concerns were, and used that as the driving force going into Copenhagen. In the Caribbean, we convened 3 or 4 regional meetings, getting our technicians together, getting all of us on the same page, and at the end of each meeting, the following day, we invited ministers. So here we had 14 representatives of the countries speaking to all the ministers with a unified voice. We were not fighting against each other country by country. And so the politicians were then, all of us are saying the same thing. We now have something concrete to take. And it culminated in Paris, where we had a pavilion centrally located. The Caribbean Pavilion was on a crossroads that led to the main plenary and to the meeting halls. We had artists from Belize and from Jamaica performing songs they had never met before. They got there and they blended so well together and individually. Garifuna music, reggae, and so on. And the message was the 1.5. It was a showstopper. Every midday, people would stop listening to these 2 artists perform. In fact, they were even invited to a high-level event, a reception, one of the evenings, again, to play for the high-level dignitaries at the event. So all of these messages kept reinforcing it, not only technically, but politically and also culturally.
So do you feel that it was a part of the effort of France to be able to put the Caribbean in the forefront that really helped to be able to get us to this point?
Yes, and the Caribbean was a showcase for all very vulnerable island states, such, for example, like Kiribati, Tuvalu, and so on, who are really already drowning because of sea level rise, global warming, and so on. But I think we'll be able to enunciate their concerns using our experiences more than they were. And so I think we really took home that message. And in fact, we were congratulated for what we were able to accomplish. If I think the day after the COP ended, the Eiffel Tower was lit up with 1.5. I mean, that is a major accomplishment, getting that going, that we had achieved that target, that so it could have been highlighted on the Eiffel Tower.
Now, everything that has taken place in the negotiations and in putting together the agreement is a great achievement for all those who have been working and for us who would feel the impact of climate change. But how do you break down this message now for the average person, for them to understand what it means that this agreement has been signed and what the outlook is for the future?
Well, certainly I think it gives our children hope for the future. It also gives the international community hope that no matter how these challenges are, we see the challenges of the Middle East, of refugees and so on, there are solutions. If we were able to bring off this international solution on a major issue like climate change, anything is possible as long as there's dialogue. Dialogue is the most important thing. So that certainly gives us hope for all conflicts around the world. Secondly, I think it recognizes that we have to change the path to development, and at the political level, that is now in place. We have to change what we are doing. We cannot just exploit natural resources, so assuming that it is going to be always there. Belize has a good heritage where that is concerned. In fishing, in the 60s, when we introduced various measures to ensure that our fishing supply was safeguarded for future generations. That occurred. The same thing we have put in place for the forests. So we already have that kind of etiquette in our culture. We now need to apply that to energy and other forms of development that you do not take the short-term gain and forget about the future.
Yeah. And interestingly enough, over the period that you were in Paris, there was the ban on offshore drilling near World Heritage sites, which is a part of an achievement as well. But
and let me say that indeed, Minister Figueroa, in his high-level statement, indeed highlighted that as one of the achievements and one of the contributions of the government of Belize towards this new goal, and stating, look, conservation, good practices go along with sustainable development, because we are not going to cut our development because of that. We can conserve, we can contribute meaningfully for the agreement while still achieving a level of development and raise ourselves out of the poverty that we're experiencing.
Now, in terms of the 5 Cs, the Caricom Climate Change Center, how does the focus change in the efforts that you're doing at this point in time? Moving to the agreement was a very important step to get the political will from all the global leaders. But what happens now? Are we looking now at working within a local level? We've had conversations before about pushing for even infrastructure or development that takes place on a local level to keep the adaptability in mind. Is that going to be a part of the shift in focus now?
Well, certainly, we are certainly going to have to focus much more on implementation of what has occurred there and get governments ready for the next 5 years when the new agreement comes into place. So one of the first things that we're going to be doing early in the year is convene another high-level meeting, bringing the people who were in Paris to meet the political director to say, look, this is what we achieved. Now, this is what we need to do, put in place both nationally and regionally. The idea of this market mechanism that has been put in place, we are saying the Caribbean as a group could possibly create a regional market where Belize could assist Bahamas or Antigua, which has limited ability to use renewable energy. We may have an oversupply of renewable energy that we could do to create a regional market that becomes meaningful, that we can then trade within the international community through the common market that we have within Caricom and so on. So these are the things we now need to put in place, get academia, get the private sector involved, get our thinkers. What can we develop nationally and regionally that we can then sell to the international community because of what we have locally?
Yeah. And the renewable energy aspect, we know that the government has been making efforts locally. In terms of the rest of the region, is that a part of the priority as the next step?
Yes. In fact, one of the things that was established earlier this year was the Caribbean Center for Renewable Energy, which is funded at present by the government of Austria, located in Barbados, to promote renewable energy across the Caribbean. So we have a center in Barbados now doing that. So we're working along with them, with the Caricom Secretariat. We have a regional energy policy that says that we are to achieve about 25% renewable energy by 2030 and up it as the years go by. So that's an area that we'll be working on. Guyana is right now beginning to put in place systems to use the hydro power potential. They have not had anything so far, yet they have the biggest rivers of all of us in the Caribbean with huge waterfalls. So again, they have the potential. We now need to exploit it. What we are doing with bagasse in Belize can be done in Guyana, in Suriname, which are also great sugar producers. So there's a lot of things that we have done in Belize that we can now share with the rest of the Caribbean. And again, provide that incentive for us to work together, to have that transfer of technology south to south, and also then encourage more technology to come into the region.
Now, as you quite rightly pointed out, this particular region and any of the countries, developing countries that are feeling the effects or seeing the effects of climate change, have more to gain in terms of moving towards renewable energy and adaptation. However, the struggle has always been with the emitters and the wealthier countries, getting them to commit, but also getting them to be able to reduce their carbon emissions, which takes major changes within their own structures. What is the outlook in terms of the level of commitment that is there, and whether it is realistic that they will be able to meet the goal?
I think it is very realistic. One of the biggest challenges that we faced was the United States of America. So even though the administration was fully on board, they recognized that they could not get a treaty that had to be ratified by their Senate, because the Senate was Republican and not so much on track with climate change as the Democratic Party were. So they created, and we have created an agreement that allows the administration to use present EPA legislation to get these regulations in place through the states and at the federal level. So yes, we're going that way. We have some states that are very positive in that area. California, for example, has a very strong commitment towards reducing emissions of greenhouse gases, as are the northeastern states with its own carbon trading system. And they are now trading with Canada. The change of government in Canada with Trudeau coming in, a very liberal government, also played a crucial role. So here we have the two North American countries playing a crucial role. Mexico has also created national legislation to reduce their emissions. So North America is pretty much well covered. Australia also had a change of government, also on board. The Europeans are also on board. And having those countries in place then allowed some pressure to be then put on the large developing country emitters. The largest emitter is China. The third largest is India. So they are now saying, if we could do it, and we recognize that our path to development was wrong, you need to start to do it now. And we'll provide you with not the funding, but access to the funding. So it's going to be investments, it is going to be preferential loans, and so they now have a path toward the funding they need to achieve that development. And other countries, for example, the smaller countries maybe actually be given grant funding and special preference for small island developing states like Belize and the least developing countries like Haiti have access to grant funding, again, to meet that objective, because our requirements for mitigation are so small, but for adaptation are huge. And in general, adaptation is not a very lucrative area for the private sector. I mean, how much money can you gain by replenishing a beach or ensuring a coral reef is restored, even though eventually maybe your tourism market is going to be developed, but it's much more difficult to quantify and to get private investment in that area. It requires more grant funding from the public sector.
Now, the agreement has been criticized as idealistic. What do you say to that?
If you want to be ambitious, you have to be idealistic. If, for example, President Kennedy back in 1961 had not said, by the end of this decade, we will have somebody on the moon, that was idealistic. But it gave impetus to NASA and to the private sector to work on a space program. And by 1968, they were able to land on the moon. So we need that kind of idealism if we're going to achieve anything meaningful. It is realistic in the sense that it recognizes that we will maintain global warming to as far below 2 degrees Celsius as possible, which everyone says are achievable. And we just said, let's make it 1.5 the target. Okay. And in fact, it is going to be based on science. So the agreement mandates the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change to create a special report by 2018 on 1.5 and the targets and the pathways to achieve 1.5, so that in 2018 we can look at it based on the science to see, is that achievable or not?
Now, my final point really has to look at the issue of moving beyond the agreement itself. As you pointed out, there's more of a positive reinforcement system in place, and kind of just an embarrassment from the other political leaders once you don't meet your targets. Who monitors what will take place? As you mentioned, there's not an international body that will do so, so who will monitor?
Well, indeed, we do have the Climate Change Secretariat, which is the repository of all the information that is going to be transmitted. The Conference of the Parties, the countries, meet together at the end of each year where these reports are presented to them, and then they review it. And in the interim, then there is this scientific body, a committee that is going to look at the technical details and, if necessary, actually go into a country to see what has occurred. But as I said, it is going to be facilitative. It is going to be a much more of an encouraging type of agreement. Every 5 years, we will, as I said, look at these, what has been submitted, and you are required to do it for the 5 years. But also, the agreement does say that countries commit to peak their emissions as early as possible and then decline rapidly thereafter, achieving neutrality in the second half of the century, so that by after 2050, the international community should be emitting as much as it's absorbing, so we go carbon neutral. Okay. So again, it is aspirational, but we have put in pathways to achieve that.
And if you get close enough to it, it's still a good sign.
Definitely, yes.
All right, Mr. Fuller. Well, thank you very much for joining us and being able to share the outcome of COP21. And we will, of course, have further conversations with you as the time goes by. Right?
Thank you very much, Marlene. It's been a pleasure to be here. And indeed, we need to get this information now out to the public, because the public are the ones who are going to have to implement this agreement.
That's right. All right, we're going to go ahead and take a break, and when we come back, it's to shift focus and talk to the importers of the Guyanese rice for their perspective as to the standoff that is currently going on. So we'll be back with that in a few.